China appears as an invincible global factory, protected by the world's largest naval fleet. Most of us assume that the only thing that could threaten this machine is Washington or the Taiwan Strait. But looking past the surface-level news, Beijing's biggest nightmare doesn't come from a superpower standoff. Their Achilles heel lies 4,000 miles away, in a narrow strip of saltwater just 24 miles wide, the Strait of Hormuz. Every single day, around 20 million barrels of oil flow through this choke point. And it's not just for fuel. That oil creates the plastic for electronics, the fertilizer for agriculture, and the polyester for a massive fast fashion industry. If Hormuz closes, the factory of the world loses 50% of its vital raw materials overnight. This isn't just a military scenario, it's a self-destruct button for the global supply chain. And the terrifying truth is, China doesn't control who pushes that button. To understand why Beijing loses sleep over a Middle Eastern strait, we have to look at how this industrial juggernaut consumes energy. China's access to oil can be divided into 3 lifelines, ranging from expensive but safe to dirt cheap but deadly. The first lifeline is homegrown extraction. The cost here is very high, roughly $40 to $50 a barrel just to get it out of the ground. Take the Daqing oil field in northeastern China, for example. It is geopolitically untouchable. But the fatal flaw is volume. Despite pumping billions into deep drilling, domestic fields are past their prime and can only meet about 25 to 30% of China's total demand. They cannot simply dig up more oil from dry land. The second lifeline is what we can call the land bunkers. These are transnational pipelines. The upfront capital expenditure is massive, often tens of billions of dollars per project, like the Espo crude pipeline from Russia, or the pipeline running from Myanmar into Yunnan province. These pipelines are physically immune to Western naval blockades. However, a pipeline is a static structure with a hard bottleneck. Even pumping 24/7, the entire overland system barely scratches the surface of China's energy thirst. The third and final lifeline is the highway of death. This is ocean freight via very large crude carriers, or VLCCs. It is dirt cheap. Moving a barrel of oil from the Persian Gulf to China's eastern coast costs just $2 to $4. Over 50% of China's oil takes this route, squeezing through the 24-mile-wide Strait of Hormuz. It carries massive volumes at unbeatable prices, but the trade-off is extreme vulnerability. These ships are slow, unarmed, and forced through narrow choke points where a single conflict could shut down the entire route. You might think the cost of importing oil is just the price of the barrel, plus shipping. But to keep this fragile lifeline through Hormuz open, the Chinese government pays massive hidden costs. Essentially, geopolitical protection money. The first hidden cost is the desperate attempt to build bypasses. Take the Gwadar port in Pakistan, part of a $62 billion economic corridor. The goal was to dock ships outside the Persian Gulf, then pump the oil through a 2,000-mile pipeline over the Himalayas into China, bypassing the Strait of Malacca entirely. But protecting a pipeline through volatile regions is astronomically more expensive than the economic efficiency it provides. The second cost is building a blue water navy. For decades, China essentially free-rode on the security umbrella provided by the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet in the Middle East. But as tensions rise, they can no longer trust a rival with their economic lifeline. Hence, the billions spent on aircraft carriers, destroyers, and their first overseas military base in Djibouti. The ultimate barrier to entry in global energy security isn't having the money to buy oil. It's having the expeditionary military power to ensure your $150 million oil tanker isn't seized or sunk halfway across the world. Without that, you aren't a buyer, you're a hostage. So, what actually happens to the Chinese economy if Hormuz closes? Most people picture long lines at the gas station. But let's look at this like an economist. Here is the counterintuitive insight. Oil flowing through Hormuz isn't just burned for energy. It is the raw material of the modern physical world. Think of it like a game of Jenga, with Hormuz as the foundational block. Refineries in Guangdong don't just make gasoline. They crack crude oil molecules to make polyethylene plastics for TVs and packaging, polyester fibers for fast fashion like Shein, and fertilizers for agriculture. If Hormuz is locked down, the world instantly loses 20% of its oil supply. Prices wouldn't just hit $100 a barrel. Financial models suggest they could spike to $150 or even $200 a barrel in a matter of weeks. Here is how the profit destruction unfolds. First, the input cost for anything made of plastic or chemicals jumps by 50 to 80%. Second, profit margins are completely wiped out. Chinese manufacturing dominates because of massive scale and razor-thin margins, usually just 3 to 5%. When input costs surge, that margin turns negative overnight. This creates a nutcracker effect. If factories raise prices, global inflation explodes and Western consumers stop buying. If they keep prices the same, they lose money on every item they produce. This triggers a chain reaction. Tens of thousands of factories shut down, workers are laid off, mortgages go unpaid, and the crisis infects the banking and real estate sectors. Closing Hormuz doesn't steal money from China's treasury. It completely annihilates their price-competitive advantage. We imagine a strait blockade as a Hollywood movie: warships, naval mines, and anti-ship missiles. But in modern finance, Hormuz would close long before the first missile is fired. The real operational mechanism lies in an insider maritime term, the insurance-driven embargo. A VLCC hull is worth about $130 million, carrying $160 million worth of oil. That is nearly $300 million floating on the water. No shipping company lets a vessel leave port without maritime insurance. And the global maritime insurance market is essentially controlled by an elite group in London, the Joint War Committee. If there is a conflict in the Persian Gulf, this committee will immediately classify Hormuz as a war risk zone. Once that happens, standard insurance is suspended. To enter Hormuz, the ship owner must buy an additional war risk premium. Normally, this is practically zero, but in a crisis it can jump to 5 or even 10% of the hull's value for a single voyage. This means just to steer a ship into Hormuz, a company has to pay $10 to $15 million in cash up front. Most private shipping lines will simply drop anchor and refuse the order. You don't need a massive fleet to blockade Hormuz. You just need to create enough risk for risk analysts in London to hike the premiums. The strait automatically becomes a dead zone without a single shot being fired. To see the destructive power of this maritime chokepoint, let's look at history and modern strategy. The failure case is the tanker war from 1984 to 1988. During the peak of the Iran-Iraq War, unable to win on land, both nations started attacking each other's wallets by bombing neutral oil tankers in the Gulf. Over 400 commercial ships were attacked. Japan, Europe, and the US suffered a massive shock. Insurance premiums skyrocketed by 400%. The failure here was building an economy entirely dependent on a choke point in a war zone without a backup plan. The lesson was clear. Energy security cannot be bought with commercial contracts. It is only guaranteed by naval firepower. The success case is China's electric vehicle escape strategy. Look at the explosive rise of giants like BYD, CATL, and China's 70% dominance in global solar panel manufacturing. Most people think this green energy transition is about saving the environment. The deeper truth is that this is the greatest national security plan ever devised to neutralize the Hormuz risk. Beijing knows they can't outbuild the US Navy overnight. So, instead of protecting the oil route, they decided to stop using oil. Electricity generated from domestic coal, Yangtze River dams, and Xinjiang solar farms is entirely self-reliant. Every BYD electric car on the streets of Shenzhen means one less drop of oil they have to haul through the Strait of Malacca or Hormuz. By electrifying their entire economy, China is quietly disarming the biggest weapon the world could use against them. Let's calculate the real economic damage to China in 2 Hormuz scenarios. Scenario 1 is low-intensity harassment. A few isolated attacks cause ships to reroute. Hormuz stays open, but oil prices rise by $30 and war risk premiums bump up to 2%. China doesn't touch its strategic petroleum reserve. Instead, the government spends billions subsidizing domestic electricity and materials. The net result is that export margins drop by 1 to 1.5%. Thin-margin companies go bankrupt, but the macroeconomy survives. It is painful, but not fatal. Scenario 2 is a total blockade for 90 days or more. This is the true nightmare. The strait is physically locked. Oil rockets past $150 a barrel. China is forced to tap its strategic petroleum reserve, which currently holds about 90 to 115 days of net imports. Once that reserve hits the red line, Beijing triggers a wartime economy. Energy is rationed. Petrochemical supplies for plastic and fast fashion are entirely cut off. The net result: exports collapse. Trillions evaporate from the GDP. Mass layoffs trigger a wave of credit defaults, devastating the banking system. China's rise is a rare economic miracle, but the paradox of that growth proves a brutal law of geopolitics. The true strength of an economy isn't how cheaply you can produce goods, but whether you have the power to protect the road that brings the raw materials to your factory door.